you've probably been wondering, like, the Russian president's name is Vladimir and the Ukrainian president's name is Volodimir. So, like, is Volodymyr a Ukrainian name or is it a Russian name? It's a Bulgarian name. It's a Bulgarian name. The Volodymyr, who's going to convert to Christianity at the end of this lecture, his name was actually a Bulgarian name. It's a cultural borrowing from Bulgaria. Copying is really important. It's much more important than we think. Okay, this brings us to the special case that we're going to land on, which is the case of the RUS. And when we talk about the RUS and the creation of Kiev and Rus, we need to now know who the local competitors for power are. The local competitors for power in the 8th, 9th, and 10th century here are the RUS, who we've talked about a little bit, these Scandinavian slavers who come down from the Baltic Sea, and the Khazars. The Khazars are already present, and the RUS are on their way down. So so let's talk first about the RUS, and then let's talk about the Khazars. Okay, so some of you have asked me about names, and it is very, names are very powerful. What we name things does have a certain power, and there's a tendency to say what something is named now must reveal something essential about it. And we all have names, and like we're called by our names, and it runs very deep. But one has to be a little careful about this. So like America is called America, but we're not all Italian map makers, and so on and so on and so on, right? But we're still unproblematically call ourselves America. Russia is called Russia as a reference to Rus. But Rus is itself the name of probably a Scandinavian trading company, in any event, a group of Vikings. And the reason they were called Rus, no one is quite sure. It's close to a Finnish word, which means rudder. So our best guess is that modern Russia is named after an old Finnish word for a rudder, right? But that doesn't mean that the Russians are actually medieval Finnish rudders. So what the name that something has now, and like working it back, doesn't actually have any magical quality, right? So why Belarus is called Belarus or Ukraine is called Ukraine is interesting, but it doesn't necessarily reveal anything essential about the country. Okay, right. So that's the Rus. So what do we know about them? As I said, they're seeking a trade route south. The first mention we have of them in our part of the world is in the 840s, 850s, 860s. They're mentioned as Scandinavians engaged in the slave trade in order to gain silver. As I mentioned before, we have these silver hoards, which is part of the evidence for what they were doing. They are still nomads, right? They're marine nomads. They move mainly by sea, but they're nomads. And one of the big underlying transitions here, I've emphasized it in terms of slavery versus peasantry, right? But another way to think about this is nomadism versus settlement. When the people in power are still moving, that's one situation. When the people in power settle and build cities or take over someone else's cities, that's a different situation. So what the Vikings did was they overwhelmed sedentary civilizations. They took cities. They negotiated trade terms, which is what you do. That's just normal. What's special is that they end up settling in Kiev, and that's when we get a state. I'll talk about that. So as I mentioned, they tried to go down the Volga River, which is in the middle of Russia. They were blocked by the Bulgars, the Muslim Bulgars, and then they went down the Dnipro. Then we're setting up the history where we are. The people who dominated Kiev and Ukraine at the time were the Khazars. The Khazars are tough to figure out. We have no written documents at all that are directly from their state. It was a multi-ethnic and multi-confessional realm, which had some Christians and some Jews and some Muslims in it, but also had lots of non-monotheistic believers in it as well. The Khazars came to an end in a way which is also incredibly confusing. There was rivalry among the various monotheisms about which monotheism they all converted to, and it's actually not clear they converted to any of them. There's a beautiful novel, though, about this called The Dictionary of the Khazars by a Croatian writer called Passage, which I don't know if you like read Choose Your Own Adventure stories as a kid, but it's a novel. It's a novel which is set up as 3 dictionaries: a Christian, a Jewish, and a Muslim, where you kind of choose like in what order you read it. It's very beautiful, but it gets across the kind of lack of narrative that we actually have about the Khazars. We have very little. We know that Cyril visited them. That's interesting. Cyril, our same Cyril who went to Moravia, also visited Khazaria in 860 in order to try to spread Christianity. So we know that they weakened, and we know that they married into the Rus in some way. We know this partly because of language. When the Rus settle down and start to try to rule Kiev, they call their leader a Kagan, and that's a Turkic word, right? That's a word that they got from the Khazars. They call their ruler is first called a Kagan. Okay, so the Rus are settling into Kiev late 800s, early 900s. We know they dominate Podil. That's the part of Kiev from which you would trade. We know they dominate. They control Kiev by about the year 900. They're basically taking over what the Khazars left them. They're taking tribute from the people who used to be paying the Khazars tribute. That's a sign of who's in charge that historians can follow pretty well, is who's getting the tribute, right? Who can make other people regularly pay money. By 911, a ruler of the Rus called Oleg is signing a treaty with Byzantium, right? They're reaching Byzantium, but not with violence. They're now reaching Byzantium with diplomacy. But you can tell that they're not just traitors, they're people who are feared. A provision of this treaty with Byzantium is that the Rus are only allowed to go through one gate of the city, a specified gate, and they can't come in more than 50 at a time, right? So there's a sense that perhaps these people might cause a certain amount of trouble if you just let them come in large numbers.